The summer heat pressed down on Thomas Blackwood's weathered shoulders as he mended the broken fence line. At 53, each swing of the hammer seemed heavier than the last. His ranch in the Montana Territory circa 1870 had been his solitary kingdom for 15 years. Since Martha's passing and his son James leaving for California, Thomas had grown accustomed to silence. His only companions were his cattle dog Rex, 3 horses, and a small herd of cattle. The vastness of the Montana sky sometimes made him feel impossibly small, but he'd made peace with solitude. As the sun began to set, Rex's ears perked up, followed by a low growl. "What is it, boy?" Thomas squinted toward the tree line. At first, he saw nothing but dancing shadows. Then a movement caught his eye. Thomas reached for his rifle. Relations between settlers and local tribes had been strained lately. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice firm despite his unease. A figure stumbled from the shadows, then collapsed. Thomas cautiously approached. A native warrior lay face down in the tall grass. Blood had soaked through his buckskin clothing. Thomas turned him gently, finding the man barely conscious. His face was young with traditional markings across his cheekbones. A necklace of bear claws hung around his neck. Thomas hesitated. Helping this man could bring trouble. The nearest settlement, Coopersville, was a day's ride away, and sentiments there ran strongly against the native tribes. The wounded man's eyes flickered open briefly, revealing pain and defiance. He spoke words Thomas couldn't understand, then fell silent again, his breathing shallow. "Hell," Thomas muttered, making his decision. He propped his rifle against a tree and lifted the injured man. By the time he reached his cabin, the warrior was unconscious, his skin alarmingly cold. Inside, Thomas cleared his dining table and laid the man upon it. He cut away the blood-soaked garments to reveal a gunshot wound that had entered through the back and exited through the side. It was a settler's bullet. Thomas was certain. As evening shadows lengthened, Thomas worked methodically. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, packed it with herbs Martha had taught him to use, and wrapped it tightly. Throughout the process, the warrior remained unconscious, occasionally murmuring words Thomas couldn't comprehend. When finished, Thomas moved the man to his own bed and covered him with a wool blanket. He stoked the fire, then sat in his rocking chair, rifle across his lap. Rex settled at his feet, still wary of their unusual guest. The night passed with Thomas drifting between sleep and watchful vigil. By dawn, Thomas knew the warrior's chances were slim. The wound was severe, infection was setting in, and the man had lost too much blood. Still, Thomas persisted. He made a broth from dried venison, managing to get a few spoonfuls between the warrior's cracked lips. He applied cool compresses to fight the fever and changed the dressings. But by midday, the warrior's breathing had become labored, his skin burning with fever. In the late afternoon, as golden light streamed through the cabin's window, the warrior briefly regained consciousness. His dark eyes found Thomas, and with effort, he raised his hand to his chest, then extended it toward Thomas in what seemed a gesture of gratitude. "Rest easy, friend," Thomas said, though he knew his words weren't understood. The warrior spoke then, his voice barely above a whisper. Among the unfamiliar words, Thomas recognized one that sounded like Akecheta, perhaps his name. Minutes later, his breathing stopped. Thomas sat in silence, an unexpected grief settling over him. "You'll have a proper burial," Thomas promised. "That much I can do." As the sun began to set, Thomas wrapped the warrior's body in a clean blanket. He chose a spot on the eastern ridge of his property, where the morning sun would first touch the earth. The digging was hard work, but Thomas persisted until the grave was deep enough. He carefully placed the warrior's weapons, a knife and a tomahawk, alongside him, along with a small pouch containing personal items. Thomas had once seen a native burial ceremony from afar. He recalled smoke and chanting, offerings of tobacco. He didn't have tobacco, but he placed sage and wildflowers in the grave. Then he stood at the edge, hat in hand, and spoke words from the Bible. "I don't know your ways," he said finally, "but I hope you find your path to whatever waits beyond. I'm sorry I couldn't do more." After filling the grave, Thomas marked it with a circle of stones and added a wooden marker carved with the date and the name Akecheta. As darkness fell, he stood there a moment, feeling a strange connection to this man whose language he hadn't spoken. Back in his cabin, Thomas cleaned away all traces of what had happened. Yet something had changed. The silence felt different, more profound, as if the brief presence of another human had awakened his awareness of his own isolation. That night, Thomas dreamt of Martha. In the dream, she was hanging laundry in the yard. "You did right," she said. "Remember what my father told us about the different people sharing this land?" Thomas remembered. Martha's father had been a trader who had maintained peaceful relations with various tribes. "They're just people," the old man had said, "with different ways but the same hearts." The next morning, Thomas rose early and went about his chores. The day was clear, the summer sky vast and blue. Yet Thomas found himself repeatedly glancing toward the eastern ridge where the fresh grave lay by midday. A strange tension had settled. Over the land, the birds had gone quiet. Even the insects seemed to have stilled. Rex stood alert, his attention fixed on the northern approach to the ranch. Then Thomas felt it, a vibration in the ground beneath his boots. At first, he thought it might be wild horses. But as the sensation grew stronger, he realized it was riders approaching, many of them moving at speed. "Inside, Rex," Thomas commanded, retrieving his rifle. The dog reluctantly obeyed. Thomas stood his ground as the riders came into view. A dozen warriors on horseback, their faces painted for war. They approached in formation, slowing as they neared his cabin. Fanning out in a half-circle before him, Thomas raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, but ready. He'd heard stories of ranchers found dead, their homesteads burned to the ground. If this was to be his end, he would face it standing. The riders halted 30 yards from where Thomas stood. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. The warrior at the center raised his hand in what appeared to be a gesture of peace, then dismounted. He was older than the others, with streaks of gray in his braided hair and deep lines etched into his face. A headdress of eagle feathers cascaded down his back. "I speak your words," the man said in accented but clear English. "I am Chief Running, Elk of the People." Thomas lowered his rifle slightly. "Thomas Blackwood. This is my ranch," the chief nodded. "We seek one of our own, a warrior named Akecheta. His horse returned without him 3 days past." Thomas felt a chill. "He was wounded when I found him. I tried to help, but—" He gestured toward the eastern ridge. "I buried him there yesterday." A murmur passed through the mounted warriors. Several hands moved to weapons. Instead, the chief raised his hand, silencing his men. "Show me," Running Elk commanded. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. He set his rifle against the porch post and began walking toward the ridge. The chief followed. He was shot in the back. "Settler's bullet, I guess. I tried to save him, but the wound was too severe." Running Elk said nothing until they reached the grave with its circle of stones and wooden marker. The chief stood motionless, looking down at the final resting place of his warrior. Then he knelt and placed his hand on the earth. "You buried him facing east," he observed. Thomas nodded. "I've seen. I thought it might be proper for his spirit to face the rising sun." The chief's weathered face revealed nothing as he stood again. "Why would you help one of the people? Many of your kind would have finished what the bullet started." "I'm not many of my kind," Thomas replied simply. "A man deserves help when he's hurting, no matter where he comes from." Running Elk studied Thomas for a long moment. "You honored him in death." This is why we did not burn your home when we found his trail leading here." Thomas suppressed a shudder at how close he had come to a violent end. "I did what seemed right." They returned to the cabin in silence. When they reached the yard, Running Elk turned to his warriors and spoke rapidly in their native tongue. Several dismounted and began unpacking items from their horses. "What's happening?" Thomas asked, suddenly uneasy again. "We will honor Akecheta properly," the chief explained. "He was my sister's son, a respected warrior who sought peace between our peoples despite the betrayals we have suffered." Over the next hours, Thomas witnessed a ceremony unlike anything he had seen before. The warriors built a small fire near the grave and burned offerings of tobacco and sage. They sang songs, sometimes mournful, sometimes seemingly joyful. They shared stories that Thomas couldn't understand, but whose emotional weight was clear. As the sun began to set, Running Elk approached Thomas. "Akecheta believed that our peoples could find a way to live together on this land," the chief said. "Many thought him foolish, but you have shown that perhaps his vision was not impossible." Thomas nodded. "I'm sorry I couldn't save him." "Death comes to all men in its time," Running Elk replied. "But how we honor each other in life and death, this is what separates men from beasts." He reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a beautifully crafted silver medallion on a leather cord. The design showed a buffalo and an eagle. "This belonged to Akecheta. Now it is yours." "I can't accept," Thomas began. "You can and you will," Running Elk interrupted. "It is decided." Thomas reluctantly took the medallion, feeling its weight. The weight of unexpected connection. As darkness fell, the warriors mounted their horses. Running Elk was the last to leave. "The settlers continue to come," he said. "The way of the people is changing. But we remember those who treat us with honor." He mounted in one fluid motion despite his age. "Your name will be spoken in our council fires, Thomas Blackwood." With that, he rejoined his warriors, and they rode away into the night, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading. Thomas stood outside his cabin long after they had gone, the medallion still in his hand. Rex emerged cautiously, pressing against his master's leg. "Well, boy," Thomas said softly, "seems we've made some unusual friends today." In the months that followed, Thomas noticed subtle changes. Occasionally, he would find a freshly killed deer at the edge of his property, a gift with no giver in sight. Once, when hostile settlers from Coopersville came looking for Indian sympathizers, they found themselves mysteriously surrounded by warriors who materialized from the landscape, then vanished after the settlers hastily departed. The medallion hung on a nail beside Thomas's door, not displayed proudly, but not hidden either. A reminder that even in the vast solitude of the Montana Territory, no man was truly alone, and that honor given could sometimes be honor returned. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Thomas thought he heard the distant thunder of hoofbeats. But perhaps it was just the wind, carrying echoes of a day when the ground had trembled and his life had changed in ways he was still coming to understand.